The Wind at Major Creek, chapter number 2, The Silent Observers. The air in the gorge had grown heavy with the scent of pine resin and the damp metallic tang of the river, which the old one said was the breath of the ancestors moving through the basalt gates. Tamsky, now a man whose hair was beginning to gray at the temples like the lichen on the canyon walls, sat at the edge of the clearing. His son, a boy 12 winters with eyes as sharp as an Ascidian point, sat beside him, miming the motion of casting a net into the rushing waters of the creek. They were not alone. The entire village was in a state of suspended animation. For 3 suns now, the scouts had been tracking a disturbance, a series of sightings that had crawled up the river like a slow, deliberate poison. They were not warriors, yet they were not traders in the way Wishram understood trade. They were something else entirely. "They are here," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the perpetual, low-frequency roar of the river. Tamsky stood. He didn't look toward the water at first. He looked at the sky. The hawks were wheeling in erratic circles, unsettled by the intrusion. He turned his gaze toward the Columbia, coming around the bend, propelled not by the rhythmic, purposeful grace of Klickitat paddle, but by a heavy, clunky, exhausting labor were the craft. They were hollowed out, scorched, and scarred, large, ungainly things that sat low in the water. Within them were men whose skin was the color of a bleached riverstone and who were draped in thick, sweat-coated fabrics that clearly did not belong in the humidity of the gorge. "They are pale as the winter moon," the boy murmured, clutching his father's tunic, "and they smell of old metal and sour spirits." Tamsky felt the world tilt. It was a physical sensation, a vertigo that made the ground beneath his feet feel suddenly liquid. He knew these men, or rather he knew the idea of them. The legends spoke of the floating forest, of spirits that arrived from the great salt water to reclaim the land. But these men were not spirits. They were shivering, they were tired, and they were above all else looking. They were looking at the cliffs as if they were maps. They were looking at the trees as if they were timber. They were looking at the salmon as if they were a bank of coin to be spent. As the vessels nudged into the shallows near the mouth of the creek, the silence of the village was absolute. No children played, no dogs barked. Even the wind seemed to catch its breath, flattening the long grasses of the meadow against the earth. The leader of the group stepped out. He was tall, with a brow furrowed by a permanent tension, his eyes darting across the village with a clinical, detached hunger. He did not look at the people. He looked at the architecture of the site, the way the creek met the river, the elevation of the bench, the depth of the anchorage. "They do not see us," Tamsky realized, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. "They see the geography." To the Klickitat, the land was a living spirit, a body of which they were the skin and the blood. And to these men, the land was a grid, a series of obstacles to be mapped and resources to be tallied. The realization was profound. This was the moment the axis of the world shifted. The river, which had been the provider, the teacher, and the boundary, was about to become a highway. The men in the canoes began to unload their cargo. There were iron tools, heavy and cold. There were fabrics of unnatural, vibrant dyes, and there were instruments of glass and brass that they held up to the sun to measure the world. Tamsky watched as one of the men pointed toward the hillside, toward the secret lookout where Tamsky had spent his youth. He saw the man pull out a quill and a scrap of paper, making a mark. The secret place, the place of vision and prayer, was being reduced to a coordinate. It was being captured. "Father," the boy asked, his voice trembling, "do we greet them? Do we offer them the smoked salmon?" Tamsky hesitated. Hospitality was the law of the river. To deny a stranger food was to invite the wrath of the winds. Yet, as he watched the lead explorer pull a long metal-tipped stick from the boat, a weapon that smelled of sulfur, he felt the ancient laws straining. The law of the river was built for men who respected the river. These men viewed the river as a thing to be defeated. "We will greet them," Tamsky said, his voice steady even as his heart hammered a frantic rhythm. "But keep the stone blade hidden. They do not know the language of the spirits. If they see the old ways, they'll try to conquer them." They approached the bank. The interaction was a theater of the absurd. The explorers spoke in a language that sounded like grinding stones, a sharp, dissonant tongue that had no room for the soft, breathy vowels of the Klickitat. They used their hands to point, to demand, and to categorize. When Tamsky held out a basket of dried salmon, a gesture of peace and recognition of their obvious exhaustion, the leader took it now not with a bow, but with a nod of transaction, as if he were paying for a service. There was no spirit in the exchange. There was only the cold, hard reality of barter. As the sun reached its zenith, the strangers set up a temporary camp. They didn't build a lodge of tool maps. They erected a canvas structure that looked like a bruised cloud pinned to the earth. They cooked over a fire that lacked the sacred aromatic cedar boughs. They instead burning whatever wood was nearest, heedless of the spirits that resided in the different trees. Tamsky sat at the edge of their encampment, an invisible observer of a new reality. He watched as they consulted their maps, and he watched as they argued over the geography, and he realized that they were not merely traveling through the gorge, they were claiming it. Every mile they traversed, every landmark they named, was a thread being pulled from the tapestry of the Klickitat world. The world is tilted, Tamsky whispered to himself. The gravity of his people was pulling toward the river, toward the past, toward the ancestors. The gravity of these men was pulling toward the future, toward the west, toward an horizon that had no end. He watched one of the men walk to the creek. The man knelt, but not to drink. He knelt to measure the depth of the channel. He took a sample of the water and then a piece of the basalt. He was dissecting the land. Tamsky thought of the petroglyphs on the rocks, the images of the sturgeon, the deer, the spirit people who lived here when the world was young. Those stones were silent now, drowned out by the metallic clatter of the explorer's gear. The strangers were rewriting the story of the valley, and they were doing it with ink and iron, not with song and memory. That evening, the smoke from the explorer's fire drifted into the village. It carried a different smell, soot, tobacco, and something else, something sharp and chemical. The children of the village didn't laugh tonight. They sat in the shadows of the lodges, watching the white men with wide, fearful eyes. They sensed that what Tamsky knew, the long, slow, rhythmic time of the gorge, had been interrupted. The explorers slept in their canvas tents, their guns stacked in neat, deadly rows. Tamsky climbed back to his lookout. The path felt different now. The rocks, usually comforting and familiar, felt like cold and different weight. He looked down at the river. In the moonlight, the Columbia was a river of ghosts. He saw the spirits of the ancestors, the ones who had fished these waters since the stars were first placed in the sky, and he saw them retreating, fading into the dark water of the deep pools. They were not leaving because they were defeated, but because the land was becoming a place that no longer recognized them. The lookout, the stone crescent he and his kin had labored over for centuries, now felt exposed. He sat within it, feeling the cold wind pressing against his back. He realized that the strangers would leave, but that they had left a mark. They had named the rivers. They had counted the miles. They had told the world that this place existed for their taking. He looked at his own hands. They were the same hands that had carved the stone, the same hands that had woven the nets, the same hands that had guided his son toward the secrets of the river, but they felt heavy, clumsy. "Is this the end, Father?" the boy whispered, having followed up the trail. Tamsky didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked at the vast, sprawling expanse of the Columbia. It was still the same river. It still flowed to the sea. It still harbored the salmon. But the meaning of the river had been fundamentally altered. It was no longer a sacred circle. It was now a path, a commodity, a passage. "No," Tamsky finally said, his voice as hard as the basalt beneath him. "It's not the end. The river will outlast them. The stones will outlast them. We've been here since the Great Spirit first breathed life into the gorge. These men are but a season, a harsh season, a cold season, but a season nonetheless." He reached out and touched the petroglyph of the sturgeon. For a brief, flickering moment, he felt a spark of the old, deep power, the connection to the land that had defined his people. He knew that even if the world tilted, even if the trees were cut and the river was spanned by still, the soul of the gorge was deeper than any man's ambition. But as he looked down at the explorer's camp, at the flickering alien light of the fire, he felt a tear track through the dust on his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness for himself. It was a tear for the future. He saw in the mind's eye of a seer a time when the village would be gone, when the names of the Klickitat would be forgotten by the men in the boats, and when the lookout would be a curiosity for those who didn't know how to listen to the stone. He stood up, his joints aching in the damp air. "Come," he said to his son, "we must go back. We must keep the songs alive, even if the words are no longer understood by the wind." They descended the path, the sound of the creek rising to meet them, a constant rushing, indifferent music. Below, the explorers were dreaming of gold, of maps, of glory. Above, the stars watched, cold and ancient, shining on the river that had seen it all. The interaction was over, but the consequence was just beginning. The silent observers had become the observed, and the gorge, once a temple of the wild, was now a corridor of history. Tamsky entered the village, the weight of 1,000 years pressing on his shoulders, and he knew that while he would continue to watch the river would no longer look back at him with the same recognition. The world had tilted, and there was no turning it back. The era of the silent keepers was ending, and the era of the transient takers had begun. As he lay down in the lodge, the smell of the explorer's fire still clinging to the night air, he prayed to the river, kept the secret. He whispered to the dark water, "Hold the memory of who we were, even when we're gone." And the river, in its vast, deep, rushing silence, continued to flow, carrying the weight of the ages toward the waiting, insatiable sea. Well, that's the end of chapter number 2 of A Wind at Major Creek. It's a historical fiction that I've written that has to do with a piece of property that my grandpa, Elwood Eek Kitchen, owned along the Columbia River. He farmed it and grew alfalfa, and part of the land that he owned was the Major Creek. Major Creek ran through it, and he farmed the alfalfa on either side of the Major Creek. But we knew as kids that Major Creek had been an Indian village, and that conical lookout was still there, and we would go explore it when we were children, going visiting Grandpa and Grandma. You can buy this book, The Wind at Major Creek, on Amazon. It can be found in paperback or electronic book or Audible, whichever one it works best for you. All right, God bless you, keep you, make his face shine upon you. Be gracious unto you, the Lord lift up his countenance upon you